Newt. Right, today I want to have a little bit of fun. So my friend Eevie, the owner of Lazy Dragons, our lovely sponsors, has got this Eldar colour scheme. I watched a battle report recently on Lazy Dragon's YouTube channel. I'll link that in the description below if you want to check it out. And you can see here from these stills that I've clipped from it, the Eldar colour scheme that she's got is really interesting. It's obviously very reminiscent of Biel-Tan, but one of the things that she's done is free-handed little penguins onto a lot of the areas of the miniatures, and also sculpted some little penguins onto the bases using green stuff. Now, Eevie's pretty new to Warhammer 40k, and her painting journey has kind of only just begun, so she's still starting to develop her skills. So I wanted to create something for her, and because I was so inspired by this colour scheme, I got in touch and I said, look, do you mind if I do something working with your colour scheme? She was of course happy for me to do so, and so I said to her, just send me something that you'd like me to paint in the mail, and I'll do a little video based around me doing my version of your colour scheme. Now, the first thing I want to say is that my approach to painting this miniature, I kind of wanted to try and be fairly beginner friendly. Eevie's obviously got some basic sculpting skills, which is fine because my sculpting skills are pretty terrible anyway, and her painting skills at the moment, she's been mostly focusing on contrast paints. So I wanted to try and do some stuff where she could produce some nice looks, maybe with traditional paints. You know, I've got a bit of a thing about, traditional paints being kind of, in a vacuum, a bit better than contrast paints for most of your general day-to-day work. So I wanted to just show her some cool stuff with that. And I came up with something that I actually am quite proud of. However, the real surprise was in what she sent me. She sent me Karandras, the Phoenix Lord of the Striking Scorpions. Now, Karandras is a bit of a sentimental miniature for me because it's actually the first character model I ever painted in my life. I was probably about 10 or 11 years old when I finally got one, and it was a birthday present. I remember that we went to Spirit Games in Burton-upon-Trent, and that was where it was bought for me, along with a couple of blisters of Striking Scorpions, and I was very, very happy with that. Now, Karandras, obviously being a character model, kind of has a colour scheme already. And Striking Scorpions they're not quite the same sort of green tone that Eevie had used in her colour scheme. So I just thought, you know what, sod it. Let's just have Karandras match her army. Let's not give him the Striking Scorpion green, black and yellow colour scheme. Let's actually do this green, black and white colour scheme using this kind of mid-rich green like Eevie's got. Now, I believe she used the Warp Lightning contrast paint for this, so we're going to be basing things around Warpstone Glow, which is a very similar green, just in Citadel's traditional range. So let's get on with having a look at what we did for this miniature. Okay, first of all, I sprayed the miniature in Corax White. I know that's a rarity for me. You don't normally see me do that. However, I had a rattle can of it lying around, and I figured because there's Corax White areas in the workup anyway, this was probably what Eevie would do. So we're going to start out getting that Warpstone Glow all over the main armour panels here. Just a couple of thin coats, really, really simple. You don't need to be particularly tidy here, because any areas where you splodge over, you're either going to be painting in Corax White, which covers brilliantly, or in black, which also covers brilliantly. And this is what that green base coat looks like once it's all blocked in. Nice and simple so far, nice and straightforward. Okay, now here's the first curveball. We're actually going to shade this with Carroburg Crimson. What that's going to do is, in the deepest recesses, it's going to gather with this kind of pinky tone, which is a really nice contrast to green. It's going to pull a much deeper looking, richer shadow than if we were to shade it with a dark green. And once you've got all that Carroburg on, you can see here that the shading looks really, really nice. It really defines the sculpt. Now, it's a little bit unfortunate that because this is a fine cast miniature, defining the sculpt does mean that a couple of areas where the sculpt is a bit rough and can't really be repaired, I'm looking at you, metallic coil on the back that comes out of the sword. It does mean that we sort of expose that a bit, which isn't ideal, but I think overall it's worth it for the really nice, deep and rich look that we get to the armour. Okay, now I'm going to do a bunch of stages of Warpstone Glow and Vallejo's Sunny Skin Tone mixed together to create a nice highlight colour. I'm going to work these highlights up really slowly, but I am just going to use sort of dotty, stipply kind of textural strokes. I'm not doing any proper blending here because, like I said, I want to keep this fairly user-friendly and I want it to be something that Eevie might fancy having a go at replicating. So I don't want to use any super advanced blending techniques here. I want to just kind of keep it pretty chill. So we're just going to use this stippled blending where we allow the paint to build up, getting progressively brighter and just pulling it towards edges. And when we eventually get to the absolute edges, we just sort of very gently stroke in a little bit of the brightest color, and that gets us up to a really nice highlight. As you can see here in the completed little video reel, it's looking pretty good now. It's nice and bright. Okay, my next target is going to be the Corax white areas of the miniature, which obviously I'm just going to use the paint from the pot, thin it down a tiny bit, and just get those all patched up and tidy and looking nice. Once that's done, you can see that we've got nice clean white areas now, ready to start to receive some shade. Now, you'll have heard me say before, I'm definitely a fan of Apothecary White for shading whites. I don't mind it at all, but I do think you can get something that's a bit more high contrast and a little bit nicer. So I'm going to mix here some Drakenhof Nightshade, some Nuln Oil, and some Lahmian Medium. With those three paints mixed together, you can see the ratios I'm using here, and that's going to give me just a nice, thin, blue-black shade that when it goes over this white will give it loads of depth. Because we've got a fair bit of Lahmian Medium in there, it's not going to tint the surface colour too much. So you can see here as I'm washing in that I can actually wash over the entire surface area without being too worried, because it doesn't darken that surface so much that when I come back in with a bit of Corax White, it's going to be a pain in the arse to cover back over it. And that's exactly what we're going to do next. We're going to take some very thin down Corax White and just come back in and re-brighten some of the surfaces of those whites, ready to receive a highlight. We'll then switch to a bright white. In this case, I'm using Reaper's Dragon White, but there are plenty of bright whites out there. You know, these kind of pure white paints, every brand does one, so just pick your favourite one. And we're going to use that for a secondary highlight, just to pull some real brightness, some real spark towards some sort of tops and edges and stuff like that. And again, we're just using layering for highlighting here. We're not doing any kind of blending, so it's nice and simple and straightforward. And once that's all done, this is what your whites are going to look like. So the miniature's starting to come together now. We're starting to get a bit of an idea of what it's going to look like. But the next thing we need to do, the next main colour that appears in this workup are those blacks, so we need to get on with that. So we're first of all just going to whip around the miniature and just black out the areas that need to be either metallic or black. And that's what that's going to look like once it's done. Nice and simple. And then we'll start mixing some sunny skin tone into black to build up some highlights on some of the areas that are actually staying black. Now on the chainsword in particular, I'm going to use these really sort of scratchy, dashy highlights where I just sort of whip the tip of the brush all over the surface and then reinforce those with some brighter edge highlights. This allows me to just build up a bit of visual interest in the area without having to do anything that's too complicated. It would be quite tempting here to, you know, do a faded blend maybe where it goes from black at the base to grey at the tip or something like that. But these are kind of a little bit advanced, a little bit complicated, and I think that would be a bit daunting for a newer painter to tackle. So again, because I want Eevie to maybe feel like she can have a bash at replicating this at some point, I wanted to avoid those kind of techniques and go for stuff instead that's challenging, but doesn't feel quite as daunting to tackle. Okay, so once that's all said and done, here are some nicely highlighted blacks. This is what we've got to work with so far. We're making some really good progress at this rate. Just skipping forward a little bit here, I've just blocked in some of the minor details with P3's Kador Red base. This is very similar to Mephiston Red in terms of how it covers, but it's just a little bit brighter. It's closer to something like an Evil Sun Scarlet or a Wild Rider Red. It's, you know, it's got a bit more of that oomph to it. We're then going to mix up a glaze using some of that same red with a little bit of black added to it and a lot of water. With this really, really thin paint, we're going to load the brush really lightly, and I do mean extremely lightly. What you'll first want to do is dip the brush into this really thin paint, and it's going to look almost like dirty paint water. And then just tap it off on a piece of tissue a few times so that the bristles actually look barely damp. We're going to use directional strokes here, just painting towards the area that we want to be darkest. And what's going to happen when you use a glaze like this is it's going to deposit the most paint at the end of your brush stroke. So wherever you finish your brush stroke, that's going to be the darkest part of the glaze. When you first start applying it, it's going to feel like nothing's happening, but once you've got about 3 or 4 coats down, you're going to start to see the magic. And once you've gone over all those little red details, this is what it will look like shaded down with that nice dark red glazing. We'll then build up a couple of highlights on those same areas, again just using the red base with some sunny skin tone mixed into it and just pushing towards the opposite end of each gemstone or towards the top on that little red bit on the top of his headdress there. And here you can see what all of those red details look like once I've finished them. I did just do a little pure white dot in the top corner of each of those gems as well. That's just a bit of a pain in the arse to film because the camera tends to get in the way, or my head will get in the way if I'm going really close to the camera. So I didn't do that in shot, but you can see here that I've just added a little dot to each of those gems. Now we also need to quickly whip some metallics through this, and I've just used recipes that you'll commonly see me use for the golds and silvers. I've not really done anything new here. It's a lot of Retributor armor, Boiler Black from P3, Armor Shade, Rakelan Flesh Shade, stuff like that. Things that I very commonly use on the channel. They're also only small areas of the miniature, so I have just skipped over them, but you can see what they look like here. Now that's actually the main miniature basically finished. But I did want to do this cool penguin for the base that Eevie had done. That was one of the most charming things about this whole process, was those little sculpted penguins that she'd put on some of her miniatures. It's no secret that I'm not the best sculptor in the world. Sculpting's something I find quite difficult. So here's just a little time lapse of me struggling to sculpt this penguin. It should be a bit of fun for you at least, if nothing else. And with all of that said and done and our penguin in place, we got some snow texture on the base, we did some little painted rocks and stuff. We come up with this really cool little winter wonderland Karandras. So there we are, that's our completed Karandras in all of his glory, with that cheeky little penguin on the base as well. Now this was a really fun experiment for me, and I actually want to lean into this a little bit more, trying to do some colour schemes that are actually targeted at certain levels of painting. Now, beginner friendly is definitely the most intriguing part of that for me, so expect to see some more of that on the channel, because doing away with advanced techniques in order to produce things that are a bit more beginner friendly is actually a really rewarding process for me as a painter. It's a lot of fun to just kind of strip away the more advanced stuff, you know, no fully glazed up armor panels or super blended power swords, no void blending, no wet blending, none of these things that are tricky and difficult and take a lot of time to learn how to do in people's minds, whether or not I maybe disagree with that in some way. But it's a lot of fun for me to just strip back to very simple painting techniques and see what results can be achieved with those, and to show people the kind of thing that they can do just with really simple, straightforward techniques without pushing too hard. So I hope that you'll give this a shot, Eevie, after you've watched the video. I know that you'll watch the video because you've already told me you can't wait for it to come out. Now remember folks, if you liked this video, you can of course hit that thumbs up button to let me know that you liked it. You can also subscribe to the channel and enable notifications if you want to stay up to date on what I'm doing here on YouTube. If you love the content and want to support its creation, I do have a Patreon that you can pledge to from as little as $1 a month. There's a link to that in the description, along with all of my social media links if you want to get at me on the socials. I'm going to get out of here now and roll the end credits, but thank you so much for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.